Okay, good morning, good night. Hope you're all doing well. Sorry, yesterday's shir was not uploaded in time, so I do apologize for all those who have been very diligent about doing this daily. Hopefully, you'll be able to catch up through today's Amudim. So we're on 5782, Nun Zayin Amud Aleph, 5782, the middle of the first column. And the last thing we discussed was the fact that when you have a city, the Levium cities, the cities of the Levium, what you have is you have a city, and then you have a round circle of 1,000 amos, and then you have a square around it, which is the place where they can put their vineyards and orchards, etc., etc. So ask the Gemara, Amr le Rav Chavivi mechuzna le Rav Ashi, Chavivi the mechuzan, said to Rav Ashi, Va'ika mor shorikanasa, the city's corners, the city itself juts into the 1,000 amos that are supposed to be empty space, right? The city itself is a square, or as we'll see, not so simple about that, but the assumption over here is the city is a square, and then you have a circular 1,000 amos around it, but the square juts into the 1,000 amos. The Gemara answers, Rav Ashi answers, B'masa igulza. We're talking about a round city. So the Gemara says, V'haribua. But the whole last Gemara discussed the fact that when you are measuring the city, what you do is, granted it's a circular city, but you square it off, and that's when you start doing all the measurements, and the adding the 2,000 amos all around it. So answers Rav Ashi, Eimer Damrina Chazin and Command Marba, Ribua Vada Mi Marabana. In other words, all we said is that we view it as if it's squared in order to measure, to get the most out of our measurements, we view the circle as if it's squared, and then we start measuring from the edges of the square. But we don't actually treat the city. The city doesn't change sizes. The city is a circle city, and there's 1,000 amos around it, and we treat the city as if it's a square, so that we can measure the 2,000 amos all around it to give it the maximum amount of space. But the point that Rav Ashi is basically saying is that when you have a circular city, you have a circle of 1,000 amos around it, which is supposed to be empty space. We'll come back and discuss what that empty space is what the function of that empty space is all about soon. And then you have the 2,000 amos that, 1,000 amos, a little bit more than 1,000 amos, a little bit more than 1,000 amos that surrounds it, which is the space which the Levium have for their fields, orchards, etc., etc. Okay, now, the Gemara asks further one last question about the measurements that we gave. Amar le Rav Chanilai mechozna le Rav Ashi. Getting another question by the same person. Mikti, let's see. Kabar meruba yoser le'igol. How much larger is a square than a circle? Revia, 1/4. So the Gemara said earlier, right? So we know what that means is that if you have a circle and you have a square that's around the same dimensions, meaning it has the same, what's that middle line? Diameter. So if you have a circle that's this size and this becomes now a square, right? So it's the same middle line. So it's 1/4 more, right? The corners of the circle are going to be 1/4 more. This is the day we definitely need one of those, the whiteboard. Okay. Should have brought it with me to Israel. Okay. So it's 1/4 more. So the Gemara says, based on that math, Hadi Tamni Mea. They add up to 800. Shis Mea B'shit Neshvan Nechei Tilsa Havi. Comes up to 667 amos, 666 and 2/3 of an amos larger. In other words, the Gemara told us earlier, Rav Ashi told us earlier, the Gemara told us earlier that by squaring the circle, you actually gain 800 amos. But the Gemara is now pointing out it's not actually true. If a square is bigger than a circle by 1/4, then if you do the math, I'm not going to do the math, but it only equals 666 and 2/3. So Amalei Rav Ashi says no. Hani mili bigula migo rabia avabalachsu minatzvei. This is true if we're dealing with a circle within a square, but when we have a diagonal, we're actually dealing with much more. Amar Mar, I'll come back and explain this in a moment. Called Amsa Beribua, every amma of a square, Amsa utrei chumshe balachson makes for an amma and 2/5 in the diagonal of the square, right? So you have a square, there's a square, your diagonal, which goes this way, is much longer. So what's going on over here is as follows. When we made our Erev Tchumen, or if you recall, we squared this original circle, and then we add squares on the side, but then we added the diagonals. We added the squares in the actual corners, and there, if you're measuring in this direction, it's the diagonal, it's not just 1/4 more, but rather it's an amma and 2/5 for each amma. Okay, so it's a larger ratio because we're actually we're filling in the squares on the side, which are diagonally extend diagonally, and therefore, if you do the math, that actually does equal 800 for the circle that would have been the tchum. If you would have circled the tchum. If you would have had this, you have the city circle, and you would have added 2,000 amos in this way, it would have just been 2,000 amos. But by adding the squares, what you're actually doing is you're adding an extra 800 amos, and the way we get that math is by measuring it not just 1/4 more, but since we added the diagonal square, the squares in the corner, it actually equals 800. Okay, now we move on to a Mishnah. If the last discussion was a little overwhelming, which legitimately it was, we're now going to talk about a karpaf, an open area around a city, and I guess again, one of the things I guess we can think about now, just hashkafically, like what is the idea of why is it that cities get empty space around it? We'll come back to that discussion. But the Gemara says when it comes to measuring what is a city, the Gemara says no something karpef le'ir. We first grant a karpef. What is a karpef? A karpef is 70 2/3 amos wide around a city before measuring its chum. Okay, we'll come back to what the source is for that space. Divrei Amer, these are the words of Amer. Where they say no, lo amru karpef ela bein shtei ayaros. We only say that there's a karpef when it's between two cities, but not each city does not get a karpef around it, but rather before measuring the chum. But rather there's only a karpef when between two cities. Okay, im yesh lazo shivim ama v'shiraim lazo v'shivim v'lazo shivim am v'shiraim. If one city has 70 amos and a fraction, and the other one has 70 amos and a fraction, in other words, the two cities are separated by no more than 141 1/3 amos. Ose karpef hishtem lios echad. Then you make a karpef to cause the two of them to become one city. Okay, so again, the Chachamim are saying that the idea of the karpef is that it combines two cities. You could have a karpef when it's two cities next to each other that are less than that measurement that's needed between two cities. But for one city, if it's one freestanding city, do not add a karpef. As it says the Gemara, Mishnah further, so too 3 villages grouped together. If there are 141 1/3 amos between the two outer villages, asa emtzai ishlashan lios echad, then the middle village causes the 3 of them to become one. We'll discuss exactly what that means in the Gemara. But it says the Gemara first, not immediately, where do we get this whole idea of the karpef from? Amar Rava, Damar Kra, the pasuk which discusses the city of the Levium says, right, remember, Tchumin, Eruvin, our whole discussion in our Masechta over here is all di Rabbanan. But however, there are some parallels, there are some, we'll call them models in the Torah for some of these halachos. So one of those is, we saw that the Levium, the cities the Levium get, and we know the 2,000 amos which are measured around the city, that is one of the sources that we're going to use for the measurements for Tchum. So when it comes to the Levium, the cities of the Levium, it says Mikir Ha'ir v'chutza, from the wall of the city and outward you measure. So the word chutza is a little bit funny. If it says measure 2,000 amos from the wall of the city, you know it's going outwards. Why does it say and outwards? So Amra Torah 10 chutza v'achkach midod. First grant an outside area to the city, and then measure the specific area, that's needed for the city of the Levium. Now again, that's talking about Levium cities. We're going to apply this to Tchumen. Now let's bring it back to our Mishnah. Rameir said that you have an outside for every city. He understands that every city is going to have an outside. He understands that every city is going to have an outside. The Chacham are going to understand that no. The fact that it says Mikir Ha'ir, from the wall of the city, implies that you measure directly from the wall of the city. Which implies that you don't get an extra space. You just measure immediately from the edge of the city. Why does it say v'chutza? To tell you in certain circumstances when there's two cities next to one another, that's when you add this extra space of the karpef. Okay, got it? In other words, although this is not mentioned in the Gemara, the Rishonim mentioned this, that the pasuk says that this word v'chutza tells you something extra is happening. Rameir says always there's extra. Always, whenever you're measuring a tchum, you always add a karpef. You always add this extra space. And the Chachamim say no, you're going to add this extra space only because the pasuk says also mikira ear, from the wall of the city. So how do you deal with that? So you say no, normally it's from the wall of the city you measure out. The chutza tell you there are certain circumstances that you measure extra, and that is when it's two cities next to one another. Where does this measure of 70 2/3 amos come from? If you remember all the way back, we talked about the fact that this comes from the karpet. Basically is a courtyard. It's a space around something, and it's learned from the spacing of the Mishkan, which the courtyard was 70 2/3 of an amma. Okay, so the Chacham lo amru. There's a quote from the Mishnah. The Chacham said that we only make a karpef when there are two cities next to one another. The karpef could be in between them to connect the two cities. Itzmar, it was taught. Okay, there's the machlokas over here between two amoraim. Rav Huna says no thing karpef lazo v'karpef lazo, that we give a karpef to each city. So that means each city has 70 2/3 of amos, which equals 141 1/3 amos between separating two cities, and would still consider them to be one city. However, Chia Barav Amar Karpef Echad L'Shtem. There's one karpef, there's one space of 70 2/3 amos for both cities. Okay, so that's machlokas over here. When the Mishnah said that the Chacham say you give a karpef for two cities, do you give a karpef for each city? That's the opinion of Rav Huna, or do you give which equals 141, etc. Or do you give one when there's two cities, you give one karpef between the both of them? That's the opinion of Chia bar Rav. So it's not. We're going to try to prove the different opinions of here. It's not. It was taught in the Mishnah. They did not say karpef unless it's between two cities. So the word karpef is in the singular, which sounds like the second opinion, which says you only give one of these courtyard spaces, a karpef space, in between the both of them. To Rav Huna, this would seem to be a refutation of Rav Huna's opinion, who says that you give two karpefs. Right, the fact that it's in the singular, not the plural, would seem to be a refutation of his opinion. Would argue my karpef. What does a karpef mean? Torah is karpef, the law of a karpef. Ulam karpef lezo of a karpef lezu. Yes, it's in the singular, but it just means that we give the concept, the application of the concept of a karpef in this case. But okay, practically, what does that mean? That you give a karpef, you give the space for each one. Don't bring a proof from that. Tachinam mistabra. This actually is very logical. Why? Because the end of the Mishnah says im yesh lezo shivim ama v'shiraim v'lezo shivim ama v'shiraim oser karpef l'shtem lios echad. The end of the Mishnah says, if this one has 70 amos and a fraction, and this one has 70 amos and a fraction, then you give a karpef to both of them to become one. So you see very clearly that each city is getting its own karpef. This would seem to be Shema Mina. This proves that a karpef is granted to each city. This proves the view of Rav Huna. And now the Gemara flips the table. It says Lema Tev to Rav Chia Barav. Now this would seem to be a disproof to Rav Chia Barav, because the end of the Mishnah says clearly that each city is getting its own karpef. The Gemara says Amalach Rav Chia Barav. Now we're on 57b. Nun Zayin Mabez. Rav Chia Barav would answer Hamani Rameir. That line of the Mishnah is actually Rameir. It says the Gemara, Rameir. If that's Rameir, Rameir is the one who said that each city gets its own karpef. Hatanle Reisha. Rameir already told us in the beginning. In the first part of the Mishnah, knows in karpef le'ir that you grant a karpef to a city. To Rameir, these are the words of Rameir. Why would Rameir repeat himself, saying that each city gets a karpef? The Gemara says Tricha. You need it imyahi. If you only had the first statement of Rameir, havmin echad l'chad v'chad l'tarte. You would say that one karpef is granted for one city and one karpef is granted for two cities. No matter how many cities there are, each city there's only going to be one karpef in total. Kamash l'tarte trei yavina lehu. That when there are two cities, the point of the second line in the Mishnah, which is Rameir, we're saying now according to Chia Barav, is to say that when there are two cities, each city gets its own karpef. In other words, all we heard from Meir initially was that you add a karpef for every city. But maybe if there's two cities or three cities or four cities, it's no different than one city. All you get is one karpef space. Kamash Malan teach you that no, you get that two cities get two karpefs, and three cities get three karpefs, etc., etc. V'yashmin and Hacha had Rameir only taught us the second halacha about the two cities with their karpefs. Why is that? Why doesn't he just do that? In other words, now we ask Rav Chia Barav. Okay, so if you're right that the second statement of Rameir, why doesn't he just teach us the second statement? Then when there's two cities, you get two karpefs. Why does he teach us the first statement? So where it says V'yashmin and Hacha mishum dechika tashmishtayu. In the second case, you would think that each city needs to get its own space, because the fact that the use of their area is now more limited. That not so much that their use is limited, but what that means is that in order to be a defined place, you really need a lot of space around it. So when you have two spaces which are somewhat next to one another, unless there's a substantial space between them, you would say, oh, they're one city. And that's why when there's less than 141 between them, you'd say, oh, it's one city. Because to really define yourself as an entity, you really need a lot of space around it. Therefore, had it only had the second case, the case of two cities, you'd say, oh, there you need to have karpefs, because you really need, in order to really, because if you really want to start defining them as see them as a city, it's going to have a decent amount of space around it. But in the case of a lone city where there is nothing around it, you have a lone city sitting in the middle of nowhere, and there's nothing around it, there you'd say, I don't need a karpef around it, I don't need this extra space to give it this extra space to define it as a city. Nothing else is around it. Aim alow, therefore you'd say no karpef is granted at all. Tzricha, therefore you need them both. So what's going on over here? That what basically is happening is Rameir and even the Rabbanan are teaching us that to define a space, you really need to define a entity. You really need space around it. What that means is that when we define like a place of residence, right? The same way a home is defined by the walls around it, a city is defined by the empty space around it. That to define, this idea of boundaries, the idea of having, you don't have a simply like a home and it's like in someone else's home. No, a home is a separate place. So the same way with a city, it needs empty spaces around it. That's the whole premise of Rameir's halacha over here, and really the Rabbanan as well. That basically, right, Rameir is saying every city is going to have this empty space around it, because without giving it empty space, it's not defined as an entity. Just like a person, if you don't have space around you, if you're just completely bleeding into everyone else's life around you, your family, your friends, this and that, you're not a person. You're not yourself, right? You really need to have this space around you, and then you become a person. Then you become an entity. So Rameir says that's true all the time. Even if you're like a person on an island, you still need to have boundaries, whatever that means. Rabbanan say no. When it's two cities, then you need to have boundaries. When it's one city, when it's one on your own, then there's no need for a boundary. Okay, that's the machlokas between them. We'll pick up in a moment.